In the world of the ultra-wealthy, there exists a truth that money cannot purchase: absolute safety. Margaret Brennan had spent $2.3 million transforming her clifftop estate into a surveillance fortress. 31 cameras, motion sensors woven into every hallway, AI facial recognition software that could detect micro-expressions of deception. She believed that if she could see everything, nothing could ever hurt her again. But at 3:47 every morning, camera 14 in the West Wing corridor captured something that shattered 2 months of sleepless nights. The night janitor, a widowed father in a faded gray uniform, standing motionless before her dead mother's portrait, lips moving in whispered conversation, then pulling a worn leather notebook from his pocket to write something she could never quite read. The question that consumed Maggie wasn't what he was doing. It was why a complete stranger would speak to a woman he'd never met, a woman who'd been dead for 5 years, with the reverence of someone visiting a grave. And what he wrote in that notebook would force her to choose between the illusion of control and the terrifying vulnerability of trust. Camera 14's timestamp read 3:48 and 16 seconds when Daniel Carter's hand moved to the notebook. Maggie leaned so close to the monitor in her control room that her breath fogged the screen. The enhanced resolution showed his fingers trembling slightly as he wrote. She'd rewound this moment 43 times across 18 nights. The handwriting remained illegible, the angle wrong. On the monitor, Dan closed the notebook, pressed it briefly against his chest, then checked his watch with the mechanical precision she'd observed in every shift since his hiring. 3:51 and counting. He turned from the portrait and walked back down the corridor toward the service stairs, his footsteps silent on the Persian runner that cost more than most people's cars. Maggie sat, surrounded by 6 50-inch monitors glowing softly in the pre-dawn darkness. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago. The timestamp in the corner read 4:14 a.m. In 2 hours and 46 minutes, Dan would clock out, drive away in his dented Honda Civic, and she would still understand nothing. The thing about surveillance, she'd learned, was that it promised clarity but delivered only questions. More cameras meant more footage to analyze, more angles to cross-reference, more timestamps to correlate. She documented every second of Dan Carter's existence within her walls, built spreadsheets tracking his movements down to the minute, analyzed his break time phone usage, his pause patterns, the books he lingered over in the library while dusting. None of it explained the portrait. 5 years earlier, in a hospital cafeteria in Boston, Margaret Brennan had been purchasing coffee when her mother's heart stopped beating on an operating table 3 floors above. Dorothy Brennan, 58 years old, scheduled for routine gallbladder surgery with a 97% success rate. The surgeon had assured them the procedure was textbook. The anesthesiologist had smiled with the confidence of someone who'd performed the same calculations 1,000 times. Somewhere between the operating room and recovery, that confidence had killed Dorothy Brennan. Not with malice, not with incompetence in the traditional sense, just a decimal point in the wrong place. 7.0 milligrams instead of 0.7. A mistake so small it could fit on the head of a pin, and so catastrophic it stopped a human heart. Maggie had been stirring cream into her coffee, reading emails on her phone, when the code blue announcement crackled through the hospital speakers. She'd looked up with the detached concern of someone who'd never imagined the emergency involved anyone she loved. Her mother's last words to her, spoken in the pre-op room with a reassuring smile, had been simple and completely wrong. "Don't worry so much, sweetheart. I'll see you in a few hours." The lawsuit had taken 14 months. The hospital called Dorothy's death an unfortunate complication. The surgeon claimed these things happened despite best practices. The administrator offered condolences, wrapped in a settlement agreement contingent on Maggie signing a non-disclosure clause that would bury the truth alongside her mother. She'd refused. Hired attorneys who specialized in medical malpractice, demanded records, testimony, surveillance footage from every camera in that hospital. What she discovered made the initial tragedy infinitely worse. The anesthesiologist had made the same decimal point error twice before. Both times the hospital had buried the mistake in paperwork. Both previous patients had survived, barely, and been paid to stay silent with settlements large enough to make questions disappear. Dorothy Brennan was the third victim, the fatal one. And the only reason Maggie uncovered any of it was because one nurse, a woman named Catherine Davis, had kept a personal log that wasn't part of the official record. Kate had testified despite knowing it would cost her career. She'd sat in that witness box and spoken truth that the hospital's legal team tried desperately to discredit. Her voice never wavered, even as her employment evaporated. Afterward, in the courthouse hallway, she'd looked at Maggie with exhausted defiance and said something that became the cornerstone of everything that followed. "I became a nurse to save lives, not to stay silent while the system kills people." The jury awarded Maggie $8.5 million. She used it to establish the Brennan Foundation for Patient Advocacy, funding programs that supported medical transparency and protected whistleblowers. Kate Davis had been the foundation's first recipient, receiving assistance relocating to California, reinstating her nursing license, and finding employment at a hospital that valued integrity over institutional protection. Maggie had given dozens of interviews about systemic failure and accountability. She'd become, briefly, a voice for reform. Then she'd stopped sleeping, because winning the lawsuit didn't resurrect Dorothy. Accountability didn't fill the silence in her childhood home, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same image. Her mother's face in the pre-op room, smiling with complete trust that the people holding her life in their hands would perform their duties with competence. The realization that followed was brutally simple. If there had been better cameras in that operating room, better logging systems, better oversight, Dorothy Brennan would still be alive. Truth couldn't protect you before the fact, but visibility could. Attention could. Surveillance could. So Maggie built a fortress. Not metaphorically, literally. The Monterey estate sat on 3 acres of California coastline, where fog rolled in like a living entity and the Pacific crashed against rocks 200 feet below. 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a kitchen designed for caterers who never came, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the ocean like paintings in a gallery no one visited. The architectural magazines had called it a masterpiece. The locals called it the Glass Fortress. Maggie called it the only place she could breathe without feeling ambushed by a world that had proven itself catastrophically unreliable. She'd inherited Shield Tech systems from her father, who'd founded the company building data security architecture for hospitals and government agencies. She'd expanded it into a billion-dollar enterprise by the time she turned 41. Not because she was a genius, though the business press liked that narrative, but because she understood one fundamental truth that most people spent their lives avoiding. The world was not safe, had never been safe, and the only reliable defense was information. The estate's security system reflected that philosophy with obsessive thoroughness. 31 cameras providing 4K resolution coverage of every hallway, staircase, and room, except the bathrooms, and even those had motion sensors on the doors. Microphones embedded in smoke detectors, air vents, picture frames, pressure plates under rugs tracking footsteps, windows equipped with glass break sensors, doors logging every entry and exit with timestamps accurate to the millisecond. The entire system fed into the control hub in Maggie's study, where 6 monitors displayed rotating grids of live feeds she could access from her phone, tablet, or laptop anywhere in the world 24 hours a day. She told herself it was about security, protection, preparedness, but the truth, which she admitted only in the quietest hours of night, was that watching made her feel less helpless. If she could see everything, then nothing could blindside her. If she monitored every corner of her world, maybe she could stop the next decimal point error before it killed someone she loved. The problem was, there was no one left to love. Her father had died when she was 12. Dorothy was gone. No siblings, no spouse, no children. Her friendships had atrophied under the weight of work and grief, until they existed only as names in a contacts list she never scrolled through. The people she interacted with now were employees, contractors, attorneys. Ellen Park, the estate manager, had worked for Maggie for 4 years and still called her Miss Brennan, with the careful distance of someone who understood that intimacy was not part of her job description. The housekeeping staff came twice weekly and made eye contact only when absolutely necessary. Maggie preferred it that way. Distance was safer than connection. Contracts were clearer than relationships. Then the staffing agency sent Daniel Carter. It happened in late September, when the coastal winds started carrying the promise of winter, and the estate needed someone to handle overnight maintenance and cleaning. Maggie's previous night worker had quit after 11 weeks, citing the isolation as unbearable. Most people lasted less than that. The job required working alone from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m., 5 nights weekly, maintaining a 12,000 square foot property where the only other person was a billionaire who rarely spoke and never smiled. The agency sent 3 candidates. Maggie rejected the first 2 after reviewing their interview footage. One asked too many personal questions about her work, her family, her life. Curiosity that felt intrusive rather than professional. The other spent excessive time examining the art on the walls, the imported marble in the foyer, furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Both seemed like people who wanted something beyond a paycheck, and Maggie had no interest in managing anyone's ambition or fascination. Daniel Carter arrived in a 2009 Honda Civic with a dented passenger door and rust blooming around the wheel wells. He wore khakis that had been ironed but not recently, and a white button-down shirt whose collar showed the beginning of fraying. His handshake was firm but brief. His resume listed 6 years at an accounting firm called Peterson & Associates, then a 3-year gap with no explanation, followed by janitorial work at 2 office buildings and a private school. The gap interested Maggie, but she didn't ask about it. She had her own gaps, her own years that looked better summarized than examined. The interview took place in the estate's library, a room designed to intimidate with its vaulted ceiling and walls of leather-bound books Maggie had never read. Dan sat across from her, hands folded in his lap, posture straight without being stiff. Ellen sat to the side, taking notes in her efficient shorthand. Maggie asked the standard questions with the detached professionalism she'd perfected over years of treating human interaction as a series of data-gathering exercises. Why do you want this job? What's your experience with estate maintenance? Are you comfortable working nights? Dan answered each with the same careful economy. The pay is fair. I have custodial training. I prefer working when it's quiet. He didn't elaborate, didn't charm, didn't fill silences with nervous laughter or small talk designed to create rapport. When Maggie paused, waiting to see if he would volunteer information about the 3-year gap in his employment, he simply waited in return. The silence stretched between them like a test neither was willing to fail first. Most people, Maggie had learned, couldn't tolerate silence. They rushed to fill it with explanations, justifications, personality. But Dan Carter sat in that expensive leather chair in her library full of unread books and didn't flinch. His expression remained neutral, patient, entirely unbothered by the absence of conversation. She found herself leaning forward slightly, studying him with the same intensity she applied to quarterly earnings reports. Most interview candidates tried to sell themselves, to seem likable or interesting or indispensable. This man seemed entirely uninterested in being liked. He was here for a job, not a relationship. That suited her perfectly. One final question formed before she could reconsider its necessity. "Do you have any questions for me?" Dan looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion exactly, more like careful assessment, the look of someone deciding how honest to be. Finally, "Will I be working alone?" "Yes." "Good." She hired him. Dan started the following Monday. Maggie watched his first shift from her control room, monitors glowing in the darkness, coffee cooling beside her keyboard. The cameras captured him entering through the service entrance at exactly 11 p.m., dressed in the gray uniform the agency provided. He signed in using the electronic tablet mounted by the door, then spent 5 minutes in the utility closet reviewing cleaning supplies and equipment with the methodical attention of someone who understood that preparation prevented mistakes. He didn't touch anything he didn't need, didn't explore, got to work. The pattern emerged immediately, so consistent it felt almost ritualistic. Dan moved through the estate with mechanical precision that suggested the physical labor was less important than the structure itself. He started in the foyer, sweeping the imported marble in long, overlapping strokes that left no gaps, then mopping, working backward toward the entrance so his footprints didn't mar the wet surface. He cleaned the baseboards with a damp cloth, checking corners where dust accumulated, polished the brass fixtures until they reflected the overhead lights like mirrors. From there, he moved to the main corridor, repeating the process: sweep, mop, wipe, polish. Then the kitchen, where he emptied trash bins, sanitized counters, cleaned the industrial sink, and inspected the refrigerator seals for accumulated grime. He worked in silence, except for the sound of water running and the soft scrape of his tools against tile and steel. Maggie watched for 3 hours that first night, convinced she would eventually observe something concerning. A hesitation, a lingering glance at something expensive, a deviation from his stated route. People always revealed themselves if you watched long enough. They got comfortable, made mistakes, let their masks slip. But Dan didn't. He worked with the focus of someone for whom the task itself mattered, not the paycheck or the prestige of the location. When he finished the kitchen, he moved to the library, dusting shelves from top to bottom, realigning books that had shifted, vacuuming under furniture with the same careful attention he'd given every other space. At 2:30 a.m., he took his first break, sitting in the staff room with a turkey sandwich he'd brought from home and a thermos of coffee. He ate in silence, staring at nothing in particular, then cleaned up after himself with the same precision he applied to his work and returned to his duties. By 7 a.m., when his shift ended, the estate gleamed. Every surface was spotless, every corner attended to. Dan logged out, drove away in his dented Honda, and left behind no trace of himself except the scent of lemon cleaner and the faint squeak of freshly polished floors. Maggie went to bed at 8 and woke at noon, feeling unsettled in ways she couldn't articulate. Dan had done exactly what she'd hired him to do. He'd been efficient, thorough, invisible. Perfect. And yet she found herself pulling up the footage again, watching his hands as he worked, the way he checked his watch periodically, not frantically, but with the regularity of someone keeping time for a reason beyond simple punctuality. The way he paused sometimes in doorways, head tilted slightly, as if listening for something the microphones couldn't capture. The way his expression never changed, not even when he was alone and thought no one was watching. Because of course, someone was watching. Maggie was always watching. The second night followed the same pattern, and the third, and the fourth. Dan arrived at 11, worked with mechanical precision, took his break at 2:30, finished at 7. He never deviated, never relaxed, never treated the estate like a workplace so much as a vow he was keeping to someone. By the end of the first week, Maggie had compiled what she told herself was an employment profile, but recognized in her more honest moments as something closer to obsession. Daniel Carter, 43 years old, widower, single father to a 10-year-old daughter named Lily. The 3-year gap in his resume corresponded with his wife's illness and death, which explained the career shift from accounting to janitorial work. He likely needed overnight hours to be home during the day when his daughter was at school. The job wasn't a career, it was a necessity, a way to keep food on the table and a roof overhead while managing the logistics of single parenthood. That knowledge should have made him more understandable, more predictable. Instead, it deepened the mystery. Because a man working out of desperation would cut corners, rush tasks, show signs of the exhaustion that came from shouldering too much alone. Dan showed none of that. He moved through the estate like someone who understood that how you did anything was how you did everything. That integrity wasn't something you performed for cameras, but something you maintained in the dark when no one was looking. Except someone was looking. And the contradiction between his careful control and the obvious weight he carried made Maggie watch him with increasing intensity, searching for the crack in the facade, the moment when the real Daniel Carter would emerge from behind the professional mask. That moment came on night 11. Dan followed his usual route through the estate, each movement so familiar to Maggie now that she could predict his location within 30-second intervals. Foyer at 11:15, main corridor at midnight, kitchen at 1:30, library at 2, break at 2:30, upstairs corridors at 3:15. But at 3:17 a.m., he deviated. Instead of heading to the upstairs bedrooms as his route dictated, Dan turned left into the west wing, a quieter section of the house that Maggie rarely used. The wing held guest rooms that never hosted guests, a sitting area with furniture still wrapped in protective covers, and at the far end, down a hallway lit by sconces that created more shadow than illumination, a single portrait. The portrait was of Dorothy Brennan. It had been painted 6 months before she died, commissioned as a birthday gift from Maggie's father decades earlier, before his own death had left Dorothy to raise their daughter alone. The artist had captured Dorothy sitting in a garden chair, sunlight filtering through trees behind her, wearing a blue dress and a slight smile that suggested she'd just been told something amusing. He'd captured her perfectly. The warmth in her eyes, the gentle strength in her posture, the quality she'd possessed of making people feel genuinely seen, as if their concerns mattered more than her own comfort. Maggie had kept the portrait after Dorothy's death, but couldn't bear to look at it daily, couldn't walk past it every morning on the way to breakfast, couldn't live with the constant reminder of everything she'd lost to a decimal point in the wrong place. So she'd hung it in the West Wing, in a hallway no one visited, where the portrait could exist without demanding attention. A memory preserved in oil and canvas, gathering dust in dignified isolation. Except now, Daniel Carter stood in front of it. Maggie's hand moved to her mouse without conscious thought, zooming camera 14 to maximum magnification. The monitor filled with Dan's profile, his face partially shadowed by the uneven lighting. He wasn't moving, wasn't cleaning, just standing 4 feet from the portrait, hands loose at his sides, staring at Dorothy's painted face. 2 minutes passed, then 3. The audio feed picked up nothing except the distant sound of wind against windows and the faint mechanical hum of the estate's heating system. Dan's lips moved, forming words too quiet for even the enhanced microphones to capture. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather notebook, its cover worn smooth by handling. He opened it to a page already marked, pulled a pen from his other pocket, and wrote something. Maggie adjusted the camera angle, enhanced the resolution, tried every technical trick her expensive system allowed. The handwriting remained illegible. The angle was wrong, the lighting insufficient. Dan finished writing, closed the notebook, and pressed it briefly against his chest, a gesture so intimate it felt like watching something she had no right to see. Then he checked his watch, turned, and walked away, his footsteps disappearing down the hallway as if the last 4 minutes hadn't happened. Maggie sat frozen in her chair, pulse hammering in her temples. She rewound the footage, watched it again, enhanced the audio until static threatened to overwhelm the actual recording. All she caught were fragments, syllables without context, a soft sound that might have been a name, a pause that might have been grief. Nothing clear, nothing definitive, nothing that explained why a man she'd hired 2 weeks ago would stand in front of her dead mother's portrait at 3 a.m, whispering to a woman he'd never met, writing in a notebook with the reverence of someone recording prayers. The rational part of her brain offered explanations. Maybe he recognized the quality of the painting. Maybe the composition interested him. Maybe he was simply resting and the portrait happened to be there. None of those explanations felt right. None of them accounted for the deliberation in his movements, the intimacy of that pressed notebook, the careful timing. She pulled up his background check for the 7th time that week. No connection between Dan and Dorothy. Different states. No mutual employers. No geographic overlap. Dorothy had died in Boston. Dan had lived his entire documented life in California. Their orbits had never intersected. Unless they had, and the background check had missed it. Unless there was something in those 3 gap years that mattered more than employment history. Unless the entire foundation of what Maggie thought she knew about this man was built on information designed to obscure rather than reveal. The next night, Dan returned to the portrait. Same time, same duration, same silent ritual. And the night after that, and the night after that. It became part of his routine, as fixed as mopping the foyer or polishing brass fixtures. 11 p.m. start work, 2:30 break, 3:17 the portrait, 7 a.m. departure. Maggie stopped sleeping properly. She'd stay awake until 3:17 each night, watching the feeds, waiting for Dan to reach that quiet wing. She told herself she was being vigilant, responsible, ensuring her employee wasn't behaving inappropriately. But the truth clawed at her in the dark hours between midnight and dawn. She wasn't watching because she distrusted him. She was watching because she needed to understand. What did he see in her mother's face? Why did he come back night after night? What was he whispering? What did he write? The questions consumed her in ways that felt dangerously close to obsession, and Maggie knew obsession. She'd built her entire life around it. But this was different. This wasn't about safety or control or preventing another decimal point error. This was about connection to something she couldn't name, a mystery that existed in the space between what cameras could show and what truth actually meant. And Daniel Carter, with his careful silence and steady hands and nightly vigils, had somehow become the key to a door Maggie hadn't known she was standing behind. By week 3, she documented every detail of his routine with forensic precision. She knew he arrived exactly 7 minutes early every night and used those 7 minutes to sit in his car in the parking area, staring at the ocean. She knew he brought the same lunch every shift, turkey sandwich on wheat bread, an apple, a bottle of water. She knew he checked his phone exactly twice during his break, always at 2:32 and 2:46, and whatever he read made his expressions soften in ways it never did while working. She knew that on Tuesdays, he moved slightly slower, favoring his right leg as if something hurt. She knew that when he cleaned the library, he spent an extra minute straightening books on the shelf near the window, the astronomy and physics section, running his fingers along the spines with the careful attention of someone reading Braille. She knew he never, not once, touched anything that wasn't part of his job description. And she knew that every night at 3:17 a.m., he walked to Dorothy's portrait and stood there for exactly 4 minutes, whispering words she couldn't hear, writing in a notebook she couldn't read. The not knowing was consuming her alive. It started small, a distraction during video conferences where she'd nod at appropriate moments and sign off on decisions without fully processing what her executives were saying. The second the call ended, she'd pull up the previous night's footage and watch it again. Not the whole shift, just those 4 minutes. Dan's face in profile, lips moving, shoulders curved slightly forward like a man in prayer. She enhanced the audio, filtering out background noise, boosting the frequency range where human speech existed. All she got was static and the ghost of breathing. She tried lip reading, freezing frames and zooming until pixels blurred. The angle was wrong, his whispers too soft, the words forming and dissolving before she could decode them. She upgraded the cameras. The new system cost $87,000 and required 3 days to install, while Dan was off for a long weekend. Maggie supervised personally, directing the technicians to position cameras for optimal facial capture, to install directional microphones that could isolate sound within a 6-foot radius, to ensure every shadow was eliminated by strategically placed infrared lights that wouldn't disturb the aesthetic of the space, but would render every detail visible to sensors designed for exactly this purpose. When Dan returned, Maggie watched the first night with her heart beating too fast, waiting for 3:17 like a gambler waiting for cards to turn. The new cameras were flawless. She could see the texture of his uniform, the grain of the floorboards, individual brushstrokes in her mother's painted face. The microphones picked up everything: his footsteps on hardwood, the rustle of fabric when he shifted his weight, even his breathing, slow and measured. But when he spoke, his voice remained maddeningly quiet. She caught fragments, a soft sound that might have been a name, a pause that might have been grief. Nothing clear, nothing definitive, nothing that explained why this man came back every night to commune with a dead woman's portrait. The frustration was irrational, and she knew it. Dan wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't stealing. He wasn't snooping. He was standing in a hallway for 4 minutes, looking at art. That was all. She had no reason to care, no justification for the hours she was spending trying to decode behavior that might mean nothing. And yet, she couldn't stop. The mystery had hooks in her now, pulling her away from work, from sleep, from anything resembling normal function. She'd become what Ellen had diplomatically called a high-intensity period, those times when Maggie disappeared into obsession and forgot that human bodies needed food and sunlight and rest. But this was different. This wasn't about a product launch or security breach or lawsuit. This was something Ellen couldn't categorize, which made it worse somehow, made it visible in ways Maggie's usual obsessions weren't. It was a Thursday afternoon when Ellen knocked on the control room door, carrying a tray with lunch Maggie hadn't requested. Maggie barely looked up from the monitors, where she was reviewing footage from the previous night, watching Dan clean the kitchen with that same measured precision that somehow felt more mysterious than reassuring. Ellen set the tray down with deliberate care. "Miss Brennan, you need to eat." Maggie waved a hand dismissively, eyes still on the screen. "Later." You said that yesterday. The tray from yesterday is still sitting outside your door, untouched. I'll eat when I'm hungry. When's the last time you left this room? The question made Maggie finally look up, irritation flickering across her face like summer lightning. I'm fine, Ellen, I'm just working. Ellen crossed her arms, a gesture she rarely employed, reserved for moments when professional distance gave way to something closer to actual concern. You're not working. You're watching that man. The words landed like a physical blow. Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of anger mixed with something uncomfortably close to shame. Excuse me? The night janitor. Ellen's tone was careful but unyielding. Dan Carter. You've been watching him for weeks. The camera upgrades, the audio equipment. Miss Brennan, I've worked for you for 4 years and I've never seen you this focused on an employee. If there's a problem, if you think he's doing something wrong, then fire him. But this... She gestured at the monitors, at the timestamps and frozen frames, at the evidence of surveillance elevated to art form. This isn't healthy. Maggie's jaw tightened. He's exhibiting unusual behavior. I'm being thorough. He's cleaning your house. Ellen's voice remained quiet, but something in it had changed, grown edges. That's all he's doing. And you're barely sleeping, barely eating, sitting in this room every night watching him work. That's not thoroughness, Miss Brennan. That's something else. The silence that followed was heavy with things neither of them wanted to name. Maggie wanted to argue, to explain that this wasn't about Dan specifically, but about security and responsibility, and making sure nothing slipped through the cracks the way Dorothy's decimal point error had slipped through. But the words wouldn't come because they weren't true. She was watching Dan because she needed to understand him, and the need had become so consuming it frightened her in ways she couldn't articulate even to herself. Ellen picked up the untouched tray from the previous day and replaced it with the new one. I'll leave this here. Please eat something, and please... Her voice softened almost imperceptibly. Please consider getting some rest. After Ellen left, Maggie sat in the dim light of her control room, surrounded by monitors showing empty hallways where nothing was happening. She looked at the lunch tray, grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, a small salad, food that would grow cold while she waited for 11 p.m. to arrive so she could watch a man she'd never spoken to beyond a 6-minute interview clean her house with methodical precision. She picked up the fork, put it down, pushed the tray aside. The pattern continued. Maggie's days became a blur of time between Dan's shifts. She slept in fragments, 3 hours here, 2 there, always waking before 11 so she wouldn't miss his arrival. She stopped scheduling afternoon meetings because she couldn't focus past the countdown to 3:17. She ignored emails from friends she barely remembered having. Her assistant started flagging messages as urgent just to get her attention, and even then, Maggie only skimmed them, her mind already on the clock, on the impending moment when Dan would walk to that portrait and whisper secrets to her dead mother. She knew it was unhealthy. She knew Ellen was right. She knew she was exhibiting the same obsessive patterns she'd diagnosed in others and labeled destructive. But knowing didn't change the pull. Every night she told herself she'd watch for just an hour, just enough to ensure everything was secure. And every night she stayed until dawn, tracking Dan's movements through the estate, cataloging every pause, every deviation, every micro-expression the cameras could capture and the software could analyze. The portrait remained the center of her focus. She studied it during the day when Dan wasn't there, trying to see what he saw. Dorothy's face frozen in that moment of sunlit contentment, the blue dress, the garden background, The slight smile. What about this image drew him back night after night? Was it the composition, the colors, the quality of light? Or was it something else? Something Maggie couldn't perceive because she was looking through cameras instead of standing in the room herself. That thought bothered her more than she wanted to admit. The cameras were supposed to be better than being present, more objective, more comprehensive. They captured everything without the bias of human perception, recorded moments that memory would distort or forget. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe surveillance showed you what happened without explaining why it mattered, gave you data without context, images without understanding. She upgraded the system again. This time, she added motion-sensitive triggers that would alert her phone the instant Dan entered the West Wing. She installed cameras with facial recognition software that could analyze micro-expressions and assign emotional values: stress, sadness, contemplation, peace. She positioned a laser microphone that could detect vibrations in window glass and convert them back into sound, a technique used by intelligence agencies that cost her 6 figures and required a specialist from Virginia to calibrate. The night the new system went live, Maggie sat in her control room with every monitor active, waiting. When Dan arrived at 3:17 and stood before the portrait, the software went to work. Facial analysis flagged elevated sadness markers, moderate nostalgia indicators, low stress response. The laser microphone picked up his whispers with crystal clarity for the first time in 42 nights. Maggie held her breath, leaning so close to the speakers her ear nearly touched them. Dan's voice, barely audible even with the enhancement, threaded through the room like smoke. "I hope you're proud of her. She doesn't know what you gave us, but I do." The words hit Maggie like a physical force. Her hands started shaking. She rewound the audio, played it again, listened to every syllable, every pause, every breath between the words. "I hope you're proud of her. She doesn't know what you gave us, but I do." Her. Us. Gave. Maggie's mind spun through possibilities, none making sense. Dan was talking to the portrait as if Dorothy were a person who could hear him, and he was talking about something Dorothy had given, something Maggie didn't know about, something involving us, Dan, and who else? His daughter? His late wife? Someone Maggie had never heard of? She grabbed her phone, pulled up Dan's file, scanned his background check for the 100th time that month. Nothing connected him to Dorothy. No shared employers, no mutual acquaintances, no geographic overlap. Dorothy had died in Boston. Dan had lived his entire documented life in California. They'd existed in completely separate orbits. Unless they hadn't. Maggie spent the rest of the night searching. She pulled medical records from Dorothy's final months, cross-referencing names of doctors, nurses, staff. She searched obituaries, social media, employment databases. She looked for Catherine Davis, the nurse who'd testified in the lawsuit, the one who'd kept the personal log. Kate had moved to California after losing her job at Boston Memorial. Could there be a connection there? The sun rose, and Maggie was still searching, eyes burning, head pounding, fingers flying across keyboards while monitors glowed in the morning light. Ellen knocked at 8 with breakfast. Maggie didn't answer. The food sat outside her door until it grew cold and was quietly removed. By week 5, the cracks in Maggie's carefully constructed life were showing in ways she could no longer hide. She missed a board meeting for the first time in 6 years, forgot it was even scheduled until her CFO called asking if she was all right. She forgot her father's death anniversary, a date she'd honored religiously since his passing when she was 12. She snapped at her assistant over a minor scheduling conflict and immediately felt ashamed, but couldn't muster the energy to apologize. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror looked hollowed out, eyes shadowed, skin pale, hair unwashed for days. She told herself it would end once she had answers, once she understood what Dan was doing, why he came to the portrait, what connection he had to Dorothy. Then she could let it go. Then she could sleep. Then she could return to the controlled, monitored life she'd built, where everything made sense because she could see it all from behind protective glass. But the answers didn't come. What came instead was the slow, creeping realization that the surveillance system she'd built to create safety had become a prison. She couldn't leave her control room because she might miss something. She couldn't sleep because Dan worked at night. She couldn't focus on anything else because every thought spiraled back to those 4 minutes in front of the portrait, to the whispered words, to the mystery that had consumed her so completely she barely recognized herself anymore. The cameras showed her everything except how to stop watching. It was Ellen who finally forced the issue. She came to the control room on a Sunday afternoon, not with food this time, but with a printed resignation letter. She placed it on Maggie's desk with careful gentleness that somehow made it worse. Maggie stared at it, not quite processing what she was seeing. "What is this?" "My notice. I'm giving you 30 days. "Why?" Ellen's expression was sad but resolute, the look of someone who'd wrestled with a decision and come out the other side with certainty. "Because I can't watch you destroy yourself. I've tried to help. I've tried to talk to you. But you're not listening. You're not sleeping. You're not eating. You're disappearing into those screens, and I can't pull you out. So I'm leaving, because staying means I'm enabling this. And I care about you too much to do that." The words should have made Maggie angry, should have triggered the defensive mechanisms she'd perfected over years of keeping people at arm's length. Instead, they made her feel something worse. Seen. Ellen had worked for her for 4 years, maintaining perfect professional distance. They weren't friends. They barely knew each other beyond the boundaries of their roles. And yet here Ellen was, quitting a job she needed because she cared enough to refuse to watch Maggie self-destruct in slow motion. Maggie looked at the resignation letter, then at Ellen, then at the monitors glowing softly around her. 24 screens, hundreds of hours of footage, thousands of frames capturing every moment of Dan's nights in this house. And none of it had given her what she actually wanted. The question slipped out before she could reconsider its implications. "What do you think I should do?" Ellen didn't hesitate. Talk to him. The simplicity of it was almost insulting. Talk to him, as if it were that easy, as if Maggie could just walk up to Daniel Carter and say, "What exactly? I've been watching you through hidden cameras for 5 weeks, and I need to know why you talked to my dead mother's portrait?" As if honesty were an option after everything she'd done, all the surveillance, all the analysis, all the obsessive documentation of a man's private moments in what he thought was an unwatched space. But underneath the resistance, underneath the fear and pride and carefully maintained distance, a small voice whispered the truth Maggie had been avoiding. The cameras would never give her answers, because answers didn't exist in data or footage or enhanced audio. They existed in the space between two people choosing to be honest with each other. And that space terrified her more than any threat her surveillance system was designed to prevent. Because surveillance was safe. Surveillance was control. Survey meant she never had to risk being wrong about someone, never had to trust her judgment, never had to put herself in a position where she might be blindsided again by a decimal point in the wrong place, a mistake she didn't see coming, a loss she couldn't prevent. But surveillance also meant she never had to be vulnerable, never had to ask questions without knowing the answers first, never had to stand in front of another person and admit she didn't understand and needed help. Maggie looked at Ellen's resignation letter. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She left the control room. She walked down the hallway to the kitchen, where late afternoon sun streamed through windows and made the stainless steel gleam. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink, looking out at the ocean. The view was exactly what her cameras showed, but somehow it felt different here. More real, more present, more demanding of actual engagement rather than passive observation. She went back to the control room. Ellen was still standing there, waiting with the patience of someone who'd already made peace with whatever came next. Maggie picked up the resignation letter, held it for a moment, then tore it in half. "Don't leave, please. I'll talk to him." Ellen's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "When?" Maggie glanced at the clock. Dan would arrive in 6 hours. Her stomach clenched at the thought, anxiety and something else she couldn't name. "Tonight. I'll talk to him tonight." But knowing you need to do something and actually doing it are separated by a distance that feels insurmountable when you've spent years hiding behind screens. Maggie spent the hours before Dan's shift trying to prepare in ways that felt increasingly absurd. She rehearsed opening lines in her head, discarded them, tried new ones. She changed clothes 3 times, settling finally on jeans and a sweater because anything more formal seemed ridiculous for a conversation at midnight in her own house. She made coffee, poured it out untasted, made more. She paced the kitchen, the study, the hallways, her nervous energy finding no outlet in the empty rooms. At 10:30, she positioned herself in the foyer and realized with sharp self-awareness that she'd placed herself directly in view of camera 7. The irony wasn't lost on her. Even now, preparing to step out from behind her screens, she was performing for them, still seeing herself through their lens, still aware of their presence like a second skin she couldn't shed. She forced herself to move to the kitchen instead, somewhere the cameras existed, but felt less oppressive. She sat at the island counter, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and waited. 11 p.m. arrived with the sound of the service entrance opening. The electronic tablet chimed as Dan signed in, his footsteps measured and familiar, heading toward the utility closet. Maggie's heart was beating too fast, adrenaline flooding her system like she was preparing for something dangerous instead of a simple conversation. This was ridiculous. She owned this house. She employed this man. She had every right to walk through her own property and speak to her own staff. And yet her hands were shaking slightly as she listened to him begin his routine in the foyer. The soft scrape of the broom against marble. The methodical sounds she'd heard through speakers for weeks now, hearing them directly without electronic mediation. She stayed in the kitchen. Rushing into it would seem strange, would reveal too much about how much thought she'd given this moment. Better to be casual, to encounter him naturally, as if by chance, even though chance had nothing to do with anything that happened in this house anymore. At 12:45, she heard him approaching, the cleaning cart's wheels squeaking faintly. She straightened, tried to arrange her expression into something neutral, something that didn't betray the 5 weeks of surveillance, or the sleepless nights, or the obsessive analysis. The door swung open, and Dan entered, pushing his cart, his focus on the checklist in his hand. He looked up and stopped. For a moment, they both stood frozen, caught in the awkwardness of unexpected proximity. Surprise registered on his face, followed by a quick glance at the clock on the wall as if verifying the time, as if mentally recalculating his routine to accommodate her presence. His voice when he spoke was quiet, professionally neutral. "Miss Brennan, I didn't realize you'd be up. I can come back later, if you'd prefer." The words came out too quickly, revealing the rehearsal behind them. "No, it's fine. I couldn't sleep. I was just having coffee." The lie sounded false even to her own ears, but Dan simply nodded, accepting it at face value or choosing not to challenge it. He moved to the far counter, giving her space, and began unloading supplies from his cart with the efficiency of practiced routine. He worked in silence, and Maggie realized with sudden panic that he wasn't going to initiate conversation. Of course he wasn't. She was his employer. He was here to work. The burden of starting this interaction, whatever it was, fell entirely on her. She tried the opening she'd rehearsed. "How's the work going?" Dan glanced at her briefly, then back to his task. "Fine, thank you." "The hours, are they manageable?" "Yes, ma'am." The responses were polite but minimal, giving her nothing to build on, no conversational foothold. She tried a different angle, desperation making her clumsy. "You've been here almost 6 weeks now. Everything satisfactory with the position?" He paused in his cleaning, considering the question with the care he seemed to apply to everything. "It's a good job. Quiet. The estate is well maintained, which makes the work easier." "Good, that's good." Another silence fell, this one heavier than the first. Dan returned to cleaning the stainless steel counters, his movements methodical, his attention seemingly absorbed by the task. But Maggie had watched him long enough to recognize the subtle tension in his shoulders, the slight quickening of his pace. He was uncomfortable. Not afraid, but aware. Aware that this conversation wasn't following normal patterns, that her presence here at this hour was unusual, that something was happening beneath the surface of these banal exchanges. She studied his hands as he worked, the same hands she'd watched through cameras for weeks, now seeing them directly without mediation. They were calloused, she noticed, scarred in places. Working hands. Honest hands. Hands that moved with absolute certainty of purpose, no motion wasted, no hesitation. The kind of hands you could trust to hold valuable things carefully. The question slipped out before she could reconsider. "Do you ever get curious? In a house like this?" Dan stopped polishing and looked at her directly for the first time since entering. The kitchen lights were bright and unforgiving, and she could see details the cameras had missed despite their expensive resolution. The lines around his eyes that spoke of more than just age. The way his jaw tightened slightly before he spoke, as if weighing each word. The exhaustion that lived in his face like a permanent resident, something deeper than simple tiredness. His answer came carefully. "Curious about what?" Maggie gestured vaguely, encompassing the expensive appliances, the imported marble, the life people lived in places like this. The art, the furniture, the lives people live in places like this. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them, a boundary being identified, if not quite crossed. "Curiosity isn't my job. Clean is." The response was delivered without defensiveness or apology, a simple statement of fact. He wasn't going to be drawn into speculation or gossip about his employer's wealth or lifestyle. He wasn't going to perform personality or charm for her benefit. He was here to do a job, and he would do it with integrity, regardless of her attempts to make it something else. It was exactly what she'd seen on the cameras, and somehow seeing it in person, hearing it in his voice rather than filtered through speakers, made it more unsettling rather than less. Because if he was genuine, if this careful neutrality was who he actually was and not a performance, then what did that say about her obsessive surveillance? What did it say about the thousands of hours she'd spent analyzing his movements, looking for deception that didn't exist, trying to decode behavior that didn't need decoding? Her voice came out quieter than intended. "I appreciate that. The professionalism." Dan nodded once, accepting the acknowledgement, then returned to his work. The conversation appeared to be over. Maggie should leave, should go back to her study or her bedroom and let him finish his shift. But her feet wouldn't move. She stood there, mug in hand, watching him clean in a way that felt uncomfortably similar to watching him through cameras, except now there was no screen between them, no distance, No pretense of security monitoring. Now it was just watching, plain and simple. Watching a man work because she didn't know how else to connect. The next question formed against her better judgment. "Can I ask, do you have family locally?" His hand stilled on the counter. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at her, "A daughter. She's 10. That must be hard. The night schedule." "It's what works. I'm home during the day. She's in school. We have dinner together before I leave for work." "What's her name?" "Lily." The name hung in the air between them. Maggie recognized it from her background research, from the files she'd compiled, from the information she'd invaded rather than received honestly. She recognized it and felt a sudden wash of shame that she'd known it before he told her, that she'd invaded this information rather than earning it through actual conversation. Her voice carried weight she hadn't intended. "She's lucky to have a father who works so hard for her." Dan's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable passing across his features. Not quite pain, but adjacent to it. "We do what we have to." She pressed forward, aware she was pushing into territory she had no right to enter, but unable to stop herself. "Still, it can't be easy, raising a daughter alone." The words landed wrong. She saw it immediately in the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders squared almost imperceptibly. He set down his cleaning cloth with deliberate care and turned to face her fully. His voice remained quiet, but something had changed in it, grown edges. "With respect, Miss Brennan, my personal life isn't relevant to my work here. I show up on time, I do the job thoroughly, I don't touch what's not mine. If there's a problem with my performance, please tell me directly and I'll correct it. But if this conversation is about something else, I'd appreciate if you'd say so." The directness of it stole her breath. He wasn't being rude. He wasn't being defensive. He was simply refusing to participate in whatever game she was playing, refusing to pretend this small talk was normal or appropriate, refusing to let her hide behind polite questions when they both knew something else was happening beneath the surface. Maggie felt heat rise in her face. She opened her mouth to apologize, to make an excuse, to retreat behind the employer-employee boundary that would let them both pretend this awkward encounter hadn't happened. But what came out instead was the truth, raw and unfiltered. "You go to the portrait wing. Every night at 3:17. You stand in front of my mother's painting. I need to know why." The silence that followed was absolute. Dan's expression went completely still. Not shocked, but something deeper, more complex, like a man who'd been carrying a secret so long he'd forgotten the weight of it until someone named it aloud. He looked at her for a long moment, and Maggie realized he was making a decision, weighing options, calculating something she couldn't see. Finally, his voice flat with something that might have been disappointment. "You've been watching me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And the flatness of it made clear exactly how he felt about that fact. Maggie wanted to defend herself, to explain about the security system, about her need for information, about the trauma that drove her surveillance. But standing here in the harsh kitchen light, facing a man she'd spent weeks spying on, all her justifications felt hollow. Her answer came out smaller than she wanted. "I have cameras throughout the house. Security purposes. I review the footage regularly." Dan repeated the word like he was testing its weight. Security. Then, after a pause that felt like judgment, "Is that what you call it?" "What would you call it?" He held her gaze, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was something other than neutral professionalism in his expression. Not anger exactly. Something sadder. Something that looked like disappointment, or perhaps recognition. the look of someone who understood brokenness because they'd lived with their own version of it. His voice remained quiet, but the words cut clean. I'd call it lonely. I'd call it scared. The assessment hit her like a physical blow. She felt her chest constrict, felt irrational tears prick at her eyes. How dare he? How dare this janitor she barely knew see through her defenses in seconds when she'd spent years constructing them, when she'd built an entire empire on the principle that walls were strength and surveillance was wisdom? Her voice came out tight, barely controlled. I think you should finish your work. And in the future, please limit your wandering to necessary areas only. Dan nodded slowly, his expression settling back into professional neutrality. Of course, my apologies. He turned back to his cleaning, and the conversation was over. Maggie left the kitchen on legs that felt unsteady, walked back to her control room, closed the door behind her. She stood in the familiar darkness, surrounded by monitors, watching Dan finish cleaning the kitchen through 4 different camera angles. She watched him move through his routine with the same careful precision, watched him take his break at 2:30, sitting alone in the staff room with his sandwich and thermos. Watched him approach the portrait wing at 3:17, right on schedule, as if their conversation had changed nothing. And when he stood in front of Dorothy's painting, Maggie zoomed in as far as the cameras would allow, enhanced the audio to maximum capability, and listened to him whisper the same words he'd whispered every night. I hope you're proud of her. She doesn't know what you gave us, but I do. Except now the words meant something different. Now she'd talked to him, seen the way he held himself when confronted, heard the quiet dignity he maintained, even when caught in what should have been a private moment. Now she understood that whatever connection he had to that portrait, it wasn't casual. It wasn't strange. It was something that mattered to him deeply enough that he came back night after night, despite the risk of being questioned, despite knowing now that someone was watching. It was something real. Maggie sat back in her chair and looked at the array of monitors surrounding her. 24 screens, hundreds of cameras, a system designed to capture everything, to leave no moment unrecorded, to give her total visibility and total control. And she realized, with a clarity that felt like ice water, that the system had given her everything except what she actually needed. It had shown her Dan's actions, but not his reasons. It had recorded his words, but not their meaning. It had captured his face, but not his heart. The cameras were supposed to keep her safe, to prevent her from being blindsided, to give her the information she needed to protect herself from a world that had proven itself catastrophically unreliable. But sitting here alone in the dark, watching a man grieve something she didn't understand through a screen that separated her from him more effectively than walls, Maggie understood for the first time that safety and isolation were not the same thing. That you could watch the whole world and still see nothing. That her fortress of screens was not protection. It was a cage, and she was the only prisoner in it. 3 weeks passed in a kind of stalemate. Maggie stopped watching the portrait wing, not because she'd lost interest, but because watching had started to feel like something worse than invasion. It felt like cowardice. She'd confronted Dan once, poorly, and then retreated back behind her screens rather than deal with what he'd said. Lonely. Scared. He'd called her both those things without ever using the words himself, simply by seeing what the cameras couldn't show. The infrastructure of fear she'd built, the isolation she'd chosen, the walls she'd mistaken for safety. And she couldn't stand to see herself through his eyes, to recognize how her fortress looked from the outside, how it looked like exactly what it was. Dan continued his work with the same quiet precision. They didn't speak again, When their paths crossed, which happened rarely and felt carefully orchestrated on his part to be even rarer, he nodded with professional courtesy and moved on. The portrait visits continued. Maggie knew because she still checked the timestamps, still saw the logs showing entry and exit from the West Wing, still tracked his movements through data, even if she couldn't bring herself to watch the footage. She was failing at both surveillance and connection, caught in a limbo between the two, and it was making her miserable in ways she couldn't articulate even to herself. Ellen noticed, of course. The estate manager had rescinded her resignation after Maggie's promise to talk to Dan, but the conversation between them remained carefully neutral, both of them aware that something had shifted, but neither wanting to name it. Ellen brought meals. Maggie ate some of them. Small victories measured in bites of food and hours of sleep that still felt insufficient, but were better than nothing. The limbo broke on a Thursday morning when Ellen discovered something that transformed surveillance from obsession into necessity. She came to Maggie's study carrying an inventory report and an expression Maggie had learned to recognize as carefully controlled alarm. Ellen's voice was measured, professional, but underneath it ran a current of genuine concern. "Miss Brennan, we have a situation. The Victorian ruby brooch, your mother's, it's missing from the library display case." Maggie felt her stomach drop. The brooch, Dorothy's favorite piece of jewelry, gifted by Maggie's father on their 20th anniversary, worth $85,000, but priceless in the ways that mattered. Last seen in the locked glass case in the library, where Maggie kept a few of her mother's things she couldn't bear to wear, but couldn't bear to store away either. The library, where Dan cleaned every night. Ella's next words came reluctantly, as if she hated giving voice to suspicion, but couldn't ignore the implications. "I hate to suggest this, but only Dan has unsupervised access overnight. The housekeeping staff comes during the day when you're here. The security logs show no unauthorized entries, just—" She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Just Dan. Just the man Maggie had hired 6 weeks ago. Just the widower with the worn clothes and the dented car and the daughter to feed. Just the person who'd stood in front of her dead mother's portrait every night for reasons Maggie still didn't understand. All her fears crystallized in that moment. All her surveillance, all her careful watching, all the instincts that told her something was off about this man. They'd been right. She'd been right to watch, right to question, right to maintain distance and documentation and defensive posture against a world that hurt you when you let your guard down. Her voice came out harder than she intended. "Pull the footage. Every minute he's been in the library for the past month. I want timestamps, movement patterns, everything." She spent the next 6 hours reviewing surveillance with the obsessive focus of someone vindicated in their paranoia. Watched Dan clean the library night after night, enhanced the footage around the display case, cross-referenced timestamps with inventory logs, found no clear evidence of theft, no moment where he pocketed something, no suspicious movements near the case. But he did linger near the astronomy books, did pause in that section longer than others, and the case sat 10 feet from those shelves, close enough that someone could check to see if it was locked, could assess the mechanism, could plan. Her phone rang mid-analysis. Philip Warner, Shield Tech's CFO, his voice carrying the carefully neutral tone of someone delivering bad news to a superior. The board was concerned about irregularities in the estate audit, items missing over 6 months, before Dan's employment technically, but the pattern suggested ongoing issues. More concerning was Maggie's recent behavior. Missed meetings, erratic communication. The CFO's voice carried weight when he delivered the ultimatum. "Maggie, we need you to get help, or we're calling a competency review. Give us 48 hours to resolve whatever's happening, or we're taking action for the good of the company." She lied smoothly, a skill perfected through years of navigating corporate politics. I'm handling a security matter at the estate. Internal theft. Give me 2 days and it'll be resolved. After hanging up, Maggie sat staring at monitors showing Dan's routine playing an endless loop. 2 choices crystallized with brutal clarity. Fire him, protect herself, retreat back behind the cameras where observation substituted for engagement and suspicion masqueraded as safety. Or confront him honestly, risk being wrong again, risk the vulnerability she'd spent 5 years building walls against. She remembered his words from their kitchen conversation. Lonely. Scared. The assessment had cut because it was accurate. She'd built a surveillance empire to avoid ever being hurt by truth she couldn't see coming, and it had worked perfectly. She was never surprised anymore, never blindsided, never vulnerable to the decimal point errors that killed the people you loved. She was also never honest, never connected, never willing to risk the discomfort of not knowing, of asking questions without guaranteed answers, of trusting that sometimes you had to step out from behind protective glass to actually live. The decision settled in her chest like a stone, heavy and unavoidable. She would wait for Dan at the portrait. Not behind cameras this time. Face to face. 3:47 a.m. She would ask him directly, without surveillance as mediation, and she would deal with whatever truth came back, even if it confirmed every fear that had driven her to build this fortress in the first place. At 3:30 a.m., Maggie stood in the West Wing hallway with no phone in her hand, no monitors showing her Dan's approach, no technological buffer between herself and the vulnerability of simply waiting. She turned off the security feeds before leaving her control room, a deliberate act that felt like stepping off a cliff. This was trust, not surveillance. This was choosing presence over observation, engagement over safety. Her heart hammered against her ribs as if preparing for physical danger instead of conversation. The hallway was dim, lit only by the sconces that created more shadow than illumination, and she could see Dorothy's portrait at the far end, her mother's face frozen in that moment of sunlit contentment, forever unaware that a decimal point would end her life 6 months after the paint dried. At 3:46, Maggie heard footsteps approaching, measured, familiar. The sound she'd listened to through speakers for weeks now, hearing it directly, unmediated, real. Dan rounded the corner and stopped when he saw her. No shock registered on his face, just a kind of weary recognition, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation for longer than either of them wanted to admit. They stood in the half-light, looking at each other, without cameras to zoom or enhance or analyze. Just 2 people, just breath and distance and the weight of questions that had consumed her for 42 nights. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Why her? Why every night? Why my mother? Dan took a breath that seemed to require effort, as if releasing something he'd held so long that letting go caused pain. He looked at Dorothy's portrait, and his expression shifted, not breaking, but settling into something like acceptance, the way grief sits in a body after years of carrying it. His voice was quiet but steady, the voice of someone who'd told this story to himself so many times the words had worn smooth. 7 years ago, my wife got sick. Lung cancer. Stage 3 by the time they found it. Maggie felt her chest tighten, but didn't interrupt, didn't move. Dan continued, eyes still on the portrait. Sarah had never smoked, never worked with chemicals, never did anything that should have caused it. But cancer doesn't always need a reason. The doctors gave her 2 years with treatment. We did everything. Chemotherapy, radiation, clinical trials. She fought harder than anyone I've ever known. And I tried to be strong for her, for Lily, who was only 3 years old then. But the truth is, I was terrified every single day. Terrified of losing her. terrified of raising our daughter alone, terrified that nothing I did mattered because the cancer didn't care how much we loved each other or how desperately we wanted more time. His hands flexed slightly at his sides, the only visible sign of emotion beneath the careful control. The last 6 months were the hardest. Sarah was in and out of the hospital constantly. The pain got worse. The treatments stopped working. We knew how it was going to end. We just didn't know when. And the waiting was its own kind of torture, watching someone you love fade a little more each day, watching them try to smile for you even when they're terrified, watching them disappear before they're actually gone. He stopped, swallowed hard. Maggie felt tears prick her eyes, but didn't wipe them away. Dan's voice dropped almost to a whisper. There was a nurse. She worked nights in the oncology ward at St. Catherine's Medical in Oakland. Kate. She wasn't Sarah's assigned nurse, wasn't her primary caregiver, but she'd come by anyway during her breaks. She'd sit with Sarah when I had to go home to Lily. She'd hold Sarah's hand and talk about ordinary things, weather, recipes, a book she was reading. Nothing profound, nothing that should have mattered. His voice cracked slightly. But it mattered. It mattered because Sarah was drowning in fear and pain, and Kate made space for her to be human instead of just dying. Kate didn't treat her like a patient or a tragedy. She treated her like a person who happened to be in a terrible situation. And that kindness, in those last months, it was everything. Maggie's throat was tight. She recognized the shape of this story even before he finished it, recognized where it was going with a certainty that made her entire surveillance obsession feel both vindicated and utterly pointless. Dan finally looked away from the portrait to meet her eyes. Sarah died on a Tuesday morning in March. I was there. Lily was with my parents. Kate wasn't on shift, but she came in anyway when someone called her. She stayed with us, held Sarah's hand until the end. And after, when I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened, Kate sat with me. She didn't say much, just stayed, made sure I wasn't alone in the worst moment of my life. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding neither of them had to name. Dan looked back at Dorothy's portrait, and his voice steadied. I tried to find Kate afterward, to thank her, to tell her what she'd given us, but she'd left St. Catherine's. No forwarding information, no contact details. I asked everyone. Nobody knew where she'd gone or how to reach her. Eventually, I had to accept that I'd never be able to tell her how much she mattered. Maggie knew what came next, but let him tell it in his own words. Let him carry the story to its conclusion without interruption. Dan pulled the leather notebook from his pocket, the same notebook she'd watched him write in 42 times. 6 months ago, I was in a coffee shop. Someone had left a newspaper behind, local business section. There was an article about medical foundations and healthcare advocacy, and there was a photo from some charity event, donors and organizers in formal wear. In the background, I saw her. Kate. She was standing next to you, Miss Brennan. He opened the notebook to a page where a newspaper clipping had been carefully taped. Maggie could see the photo even from several feet away, herself at a Brennan Foundation gala, and beside her, a woman in her 50s with warm eyes and a gentle smile. Dan's voice carried the weight of revelation. The caption mentioned the Brennan Foundation, how it supports nurses who fight for transparency. I did research, found out Kate had worked at Boston Memorial, where your mother died, that she'd testified in your lawsuit against the hospital, that she'd lost her job for it. that your foundation helped her relocate to California, reinstated her nursing license, helped her find work again. The circle closed with brutal elegance. Kate Davis had given Sarah dignity in death. Maggie had given Kate her career, back when the system tried to destroy her for telling truth. Dan had spent 7 years looking for the woman who'd made his wife's last days bearable. And that search had led him here, to this hallway, to this portrait of a woman he'd never met, but who'd saved the person who saved his family. Dan's voice was barely audible. I took this job because I saw the posting from an agency that staffed your properties. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to be near something connected to the person who made Sarah's final days endurable. The portrait, your mother, she reminded me of Kate somehow. The kindness in her eyes. The way she's looking at whoever painted her, like they mattered. Like their presence was a gift instead of an obligation. He pressed the notebook against his chest in the same gesture Maggie had watched through cameras, and now she understood it. Not strange behavior, but the physical manifestation of gratitude so profound it needed expression even when no words were adequate. I come here every night and I thank her. Thank your mother for seeing Kate Morrison's integrity when it mattered. Thank Kate for seeing Sarah's humanity when she was dying. Thank whatever force in the universe connects us all to each other in ways we can't predict or control or protect ourselves from. The last phrase landed with devastating accuracy. Maggie felt something crack in her chest, a fissure in the armor she'd spent 5 years welding into place. Dan had just described the exact truth she'd been running from, that connection meant vulnerability, that caring meant risking loss, that you couldn't surveil your way out of the chaos that made life both terrible and worth living. Her voice came out thick with unshed tears. You weren't stealing. You weren't threatening. You were just... She paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. Grieving and grateful. Yes. And I've been watching you like you were dangerous, like I needed protection from you. Dan's expression softened into something that looked like understanding without judgment, the grace of someone who'd lived through his own version of defensive isolation. I know what that looks like. The need to control everything because you've already lost the thing you couldn't control. I know what it's like to be so scared of being blindsided again that you stop living and just start managing risk. Maggie's next question came out smaller than intended. How did you stop? The fear, the need to control. Dan shook his head slowly. I didn't. Not completely. But I learned that protecting Lily from every possible hurt meant I'd have to lock her away from life. And that wasn't protection, just a different kind of loss. So I chose to trust that the world has more Kate Morrisons than people who hurt us on purpose. That most of the pain we experience comes from accident and chaos, not malice. And you can't surveil your way out of chaos. You can only live through it. The philosophy hit Maggie with the force of truth she'd been avoiding for half a decade. Dorothy's death hadn't been malicious. It had been a decimal point in the wrong place, a mistake made by someone who'd made it twice before and gotten away with it because institutions protected themselves better than they protected patients. But the solution wasn't more cameras in operating rooms or more surveillance of daily life. The solution was people like Kate Morrison, choosing integrity over self-preservation, choosing to testify even when it cost them everything. And Maggie had rewarded that integrity by becoming exactly what she claimed to oppose, someone who watched instead of engaging, who protected herself instead of connecting, who built systems of control instead of communities of trust. The admission came before she could reconsider. There's something else. A brooch is missing. Victorian ruby, my mother's. The board thinks I'm unstable. They're threatening a competency review unless I resolve this in 48 hours. And part of me wondered if you... Dan's voice was calm, carrying no defensiveness. You wondered if I stole it. Maggie nodded, shame heating her face. That's fair. You don't know me. Grief doesn't make me honest. I've just had practice being broke. The response was so matter-of-fact, it somehow made the accusation less ugly. Dan looked at her with those tired eyes that had seen too much loss to waste energy on outrage. Let me help. I was an accountant for 6 years before Sarah got sick. Estate finances are just bigger spreadsheets. If someone's stealing, there's a pattern. Numbers don't lie the way people do. Maggie hesitated. This meant trusting him, meant giving him access to systems and records and information she'd guarded obsessively, meant choosing vulnerability over the safety of suspicion, collaboration over the control of isolation. She thought about his words. You can't surveil your way out of chaos. You can only live through it. Her answer came quietly. Okay, but I need to stop watching first. The cameras, they're in the way. Dan's expression shifted into something that might have been the beginning of respect. Then let's turn them off. They worked through the rest of the night in the library, dawn breaking outside windows while Maggie granted Dan access to estate logs and inventory records and staff schedules. She watched him work with the focused precision she'd observed through surveillance, but now she could see the skill beneath the janitor's uniform, the way he built spreadsheets with the fluency of someone who understood that data told stories if you knew how to read them. By 6 a.m., Dan had found the pattern. He pointed to his screen where colored cells highlighted anomalies across 6 months. Here, 12 items missing. Different values, different locations. But if you overlay the staff schedule, he pulled up another document. Every theft corresponds to Tuesdays and Fridays. The housekeeping crew comes those days, but one person has been working solo recently while others were on vacation or sick leave. Maggie leaned closer, following his logic. Vincent Hayes, day janitor. He's been here 8 months, long enough to get comfortable, to understand the surveillance patterns. I think he assumed cameras were only reviewed after incidents, not routinely. Small items he could pawn without triggering immediate notice. Dan's accounting background showed in every cross-reference, every correlation he'd identified within hours, while Maggie had spent weeks obsessing over the wrong person for the wrong reasons. She felt the bitter irony of it. Her surveillance had captured everything except what mattered, while Dan's practical skills had solved the mystery she'd been too paranoid to see clearly. They confronted Vincent that afternoon, with Ellen present as witness. The day janitor was in his late 20s, nervous energy poorly concealed, as Dan presented the evidence with the dispassionate clarity of someone reading a balance sheet. Vincent crumbled quickly under the weight of spreadsheets that made denial impossible. The confession came in fragments, gambling debts, $47,000 owed to people who didn't accept payment plans, desperation that started with small items and escalated when no one seemed to notice. He thought Maggie was too wealthy to care, too distracted by whatever kept her locked in that control room to pay attention to trinkets worth less than her monthly security bill. Maggie called the police with no hesitation. The trail was betrayal, regardless of motivation. But when Vincent asked through tears if he'd go to prison for this, something in Maggie softened slightly. If you get counseling, I'll pay for it. Find help for the gambling. But this ends now. You face consequences and you get better. Or you face consequences alone. Choose. The brooch was recovered from a pawn shop in Oakland, sold for $12,000 against its $85,000 appraisal. Vincent had been desperate, not sophisticated. Desperate people made obvious mistakes if you looked with clear eyes instead of paranoid ones. That evening, Dan returned the brooch to Maggie in the library where they'd worked through the night. Sunset painted the ocean beyond the windows in shades of copper and amber. She held the jewelry carefully, feeling its weight, thinking about Dorothy wearing it on special occasions, about how much her mother had valued beauty that could be shared rather than locked away. Her voice carried genuine gratitude. "You saved me. The board, my reputation, my ability to think clearly about anything. You gave me that back." Dan's response was immediate. "You saved Kate. We're even." But they weren't even. They both knew it. Maggie had built a fortress to protect herself from a world that had killed her mother with casual incompetence. Dan had learned to live in that same dangerous world by choosing trust over fear, presence over control, human connection over isolated safety. He taught her more in one night of honest conversation than 5 years of surveillance had managed. She'd prepared for this moment, rehearsed the offer in her mind until she could deliver it clearly. "I want to create a position, Director of Household Well-Being, someone who ensures the staff are treated with dignity and care, someone who advocates for their needs, who builds programs that support them, who makes this place feel less like a fortress and more like a community where people matter." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "I want you to consider taking it." Dan's expression shifted to something like surprise mixed with skepticism. "I'm a janitor, Miss Brennan. I clean floors. I don't manage people." "You're someone who understands that work has dignity, regardless of title. You showed up with integrity, even when I was surveilling you like a criminal. You have skills, accounting, systems analysis, pattern recognition. You proved that last night. Those qualities matter more than management degrees." She outlined the role with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent weeks thinking through every detail. Oversight of staff policies, creating support systems for emergencies, ensuring wages were fair and conditions humane, building a culture where people weren't just employees, but valued members of a community that recognized their humanity. Dan listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, he took a long moment before responding. "I need time to think about it." "Of course, take whatever you need." He left that evening without giving an answer. Maggie didn't push. She'd learned something about patience in the weeks of watching him. Sometimes decisions required space, required the kind of careful consideration Dan applied to everything from mopping floors to standing before portraits of strangers who'd changed his life through chains of connection too complex to predict or control. 1 week later, he accepted. His first act as Director of Household Well-Being was establishing an emergency fund, $500,000 in seed money that would be renewable annually. Medical crises, unexpected expenses, school fees, the things that shouldn't break people but often did because resources ran out before problems got solved. His second act was implementing a policy that no one would ever have to choose between work and family emergency. If someone's child was sick, if someone's parent needed care, if life demanded presence, the estate would accommodate without penalties or judgment. Just recognition that humans had obligations beyond labor and that treating people with dignity meant honoring all the roles they filled, not just the ones that benefited Maggie Brennan. Maggie funded everything he proposed without hesitation, not out of guilt, though guilt was part of it, but because she finally understood what her wealth was actually for. Not surveillance equipment or fortress building or protecting herself from a world that had hurt her, but creating the kind of safety that came from community, from care, from recognizing everyone's humanity, including her own. 3 months after Dan started his new role, Maggie stood with him in the portrait wing for the last time before the cameras came down. This one had been saved for last, deliberately, both of them knowing its removal would be the final step in dismantling the surveillance state she'd built. Dan climbed the ladder and unscrewed the mount that had captured his nightly vigils, that had started this entire transformation. He held the camera for a moment before placing it in the box with all the others, expensive equipment that had once felt essential, now looking like relics of a fearful era she was choosing to leave behind. His voice was quiet. Do you regret it? Giving up the cameras? The control? Maggie touched Dorothy's portrait frame with 2 fingers, gentle as prayer. Her answer came from a place deeper than the surveillance obsession had reached. No. Certainty isn't the same as peace. I had certainty before, knew where everyone was, what they were doing, whether anything was wrong. But I had no peace. Now I have less certainty and more peace. That trade feels right. Dan placed the last camera in the box. They stood together in the hallway, looking at Dorothy's painted face, and Maggie felt something shift in her chest, not resolution exactly, more like acceptance. Her mother was gone. Kate Morrison had moved on to her own life, grateful for the Foundation's help, but defined by her own choices now. Dan and Lily were building their future with integrity and hope, despite the losses they'd endured. And Maggie was here, learning to live in a world where safety didn't come from watching, but from the courage to stay present, even when presence hurt. The following Saturday, Lily visited the estate for the first time. She was small for 10, dark hair and braids, wearing a dress covered in stars because she'd heard Miss Brennan's house was fancy and wanted to look nice. Dan had tried telling her casual was fine, but Lily had rules about first impressions that she took seriously. Maggie met them in the garden, a space she'd barely spent time in before, but had started visiting daily as part of relearning how to live in her own home. She'd dressed carefully too, wanting Lily comfortable, wanting this to go well for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. Lily's greeting was shy but determined. Hi, Miss Brennan. I'm Lily Carter. Your house is really pretty. Hi, Lily. Thank you. Would you like to see the garden? They walked through roses and lavender, Lily asking questions about plants and butterflies and why the ocean was so loud here. She had Dan's careful way of speaking, weighing words before releasing them, but underneath, it was a brightness that made Maggie's chest ache. This child had lost her mother at 3 years old, had faced bullying about her father's work, had watched Dan exhaust himself providing for them, and she still approached the world with curiosity and hope, still believed good things were possible despite evidence to the contrary. Lily stopped suddenly, looking up at Maggie with the directness only children could pull off. Why don't you have cameras in the garden? Maggie knelt to be at eye level, meeting that serious gaze. Because some things are too beautiful to see through a screen. They need to be experienced directly, with your whole self, not just your eyes. Lily considered this with the gravity of someone processing philosophy. That makes sense. My dad says screens make everything feel farther away, even when they're showing you things that are close. Your dad is very wise. I know. The confidence was absolute, the certainty of a child who had been loved well. He's the best dad in the world. Maggie smiled, something genuine and unforced, and caught Dan's eye over Lily's head. A moment of shared understanding passed between them. This child was what all the work was for, the honest labor, the choosing dignity over desperation, the building of a life from wreckage through sheer determination and love. She was the reason Dan came every night to thank a portrait, to acknowledge that kindness had ripples, that connections mattered even when you couldn't see them, that the world was dangerous, but also full of people who chose to show up when it counted. They had dinner in the kitchen as the day faded. Nothing formal, just pasta and salad, and Lily's enthusiastic monologue about her school constellation project. Maggie found herself laughing. Actual laughter that felt rusty from disuse at Lily's story about attempting to build a telescope from cardboard tubes and getting stuck in the backyard with it over her head like a unicorn horn. Dan watched Maggie across the table with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not suspicious, more like recognition, seeing her different than before. Lighter somehow. Present instead of performing. Real instead of defended. When they left, Lily hugged Maggie goodbye. Quick but genuine, the uncomplicated affection of a child who hadn't learned yet to make connection conditional or self-protective. Lily's voice was earnest. "Thank you for letting us visit, and for helping my dad. He's happier now." Maggie's throat was tight. "He helped me too, more than he knows." That night, alone in the house that no longer felt like a fortress, Maggie walked to the portrait wing one final time. No cameras recording, no systems logging, just her and a memory, and the space to feel whatever needed feeling. She stood before Dorothy's portrait and spoke aloud for the first time since the painting had been moved here. "I think you would have liked him, Mom. Dan and Lily. I think you would have seen what Kate saw, that we're worth caring for even when we're broken, especially when we're broken." She touched the frame, straightened it slightly. Dust came off on her fingers, evidence of neglect she justified as self-protection. "I'm trying to live instead of watch, to trust instead of control, to believe the world has more people like Kate than people who hurt us. It's hard. I'm not good at it yet. But I'm trying." Dorothy's painted smile didn't change, but Maggie felt something shift anyway. A loosening of grief that had been clenched tight for 5 years. Not release, not healing, but acceptance. Her mother was gone. The decimal point error couldn't be undone. No amount of surveillance would prevent every possible tragedy. But Dan was right. You couldn't surveil your way out of chaos. You could only choose how to live within it, isolated behind screens, or present despite the risk, defended against connection, or open to the possibility that kindness existed even in a dangerous world. Maggie turned off the light in the portrait wing and walked to her bedroom. Windows open to ocean sounds, phone on the nightstand, no security app to check because it no longer existed. She climbed into bed and closed her eyes. Sleep came easier now. Not perfect, not without dreams that sometimes turned dark with memories of hospital cafeterias and last words and decimal points in wrong places. But easier, quieter, less haunted by questions she'd tried answering with cameras instead of courage. 1 year later, the Brennan Carter Initiative held its first annual gala at a hotel in Monterey. 400 people filled the ballroom, patients and families and advocates who'd benefited from the foundation's work. Maggie stood at the podium with Dan beside her on stage, looking out at faces representing thousands of hours of work, millions of dollars in funding, countless lives changed by the choice to build something better than fear. Her speech had been written and rewritten a dozen times, but standing here now, she set the prepared remarks aside and spoke from the place where truth lived. 5 years ago, I thought safety came from seeing everything. I built a fortress of cameras because I believed information could protect me from chaos, from loss, from the kind of random catastrophe that killed my mother with a mistake so small It fit on the head of a pin. She paused, letting the words settle. But a janitor with a notebook taught me something my billion-dollar surveillance system never could. You can't watch your way to safety. You can only live your way there, one honest moment at a time. The audience was silent, attentive. Maggie continued. My mother died because someone made the same error 3 times, and a hospital chose institutional protection over patient safety. But her death led to Kate Morrison's courage, the nurse who testified despite knowing it would cost her career. Kate's courage led to this foundation. This foundation led to thousands of families getting the advocacy they deserved when medical systems failed them. She looked at Dan, at Lily in the front row beside Kate Morrison and her family. Grief connects us, but so does the choice to show up when it matters, even when no cameras are watching, especially when no cameras are watching. Because the most important moments of human connection don't happen under surveillance. They happen in the space between people choosing honesty over safety, trust over control, presence over the illusion that walls keep us secure. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Maggie stood beside Dan, letting the applause wash over them, thinking about the night she'd confronted him in that dimly lit hallway, about the cameras she'd since removed, about the fortress she'd dismantled brick by brick in favor of something harder and more valuable, actual community built on mutual dignity instead of defensive isolation. After the gala ended, Maggie walked to her car alone through the hotel parking lot. She passed a security camera mounted above the entrance and paused, looking directly at its lens. Once she would have checked the footage later, would have reviewed her own image leaving the event, would have documented the moment with the obsessive thoroughness of someone who trusted data more than memory. Now she simply smiled at the camera, a small gesture of recognition for what it was and what it wasn't, and walked past without needing to know what it recorded. She drove back to the estate through coastal darkness, fog rolling in from the Pacific like it had every night for years, like it would for years to come, regardless of who watched or documented or tried to control it. The ocean would keep crashing against rocks. The wind would keep carrying the scent of salt and possibility. The world would keep being dangerous and beautiful and utterly indifferent to human desires for certainty. And Maggie Brennan would keep learning to live in it, not behind screens, not defended by surveillance, but present and vulnerable, and connected to people who taught her that safety wasn't about seeing everything. It was about having the courage to be seen, to be known, to risk the decimal point errors that made life both terrible and worth the gamble of showing up without armor. She pulled into the estate's driveway, past the single remaining camera at the front gate. Inside, the house was dark and quiet, full of empty rooms that used to feel like a fortress and now just felt like space waiting to be filled with something better than fear. Maggie walked to her bedroom and stood at the window, looking out at the ocean, invisible in darkness, but audible in its endless. And she thought about herself, Margaret Brennan, 44 years old, billionaire, orphan, recovering surveillance addict, learning slowly and imperfectly to trade control for peace, certainty for presence, the fortress for the garden where beautiful things grew without cameras to document them. Her mother had been right about one thing. Love was a risk worth taking. So was trust. So was the choice to live in a world where decimal points could kill you, and strangers could save you, and the difference between tragedy and grace often came down to whether someone decided to show up when it mattered. Maggie closed her eyes and breathed in ocean air through the open window. No cameras recording, no systems logging, no monitoring of this moment except her own awareness that she was here, alive, present, finally learning to see without watching. It was enough. It was more than enough.
It was everything surveillance had promised but never delivered. The ability to live in the world as it actually was, dangerous and precious and worth engaging with directly instead of through protective glass. She climbed into bed and let sleep take her, dreamless and deep. Tomorrow she'd wake to sunlight and ocean and the work of building community instead of fortresses. Tomorrow she'd continue learning that the best protection wasn't cameras, but connection. Not control, but courage. Not watching, but the willingness to be watched, to be known. To risk being hurt again because isolation was just another kind of death, and she'd spent enough years dying in the name of safety. Tonight, though, she simply rested. And somewhere in the darkness, if there had been cameras to record it, they would have captured nothing unusual. Just a woman sleeping. Just a house breathing quietly. Just another moment passing unmarked and unmonitored, meaningful precisely because no one was watching. Precious because it existed without documentation. True because it needed no verification beyond the simple fact of its happening. The world turned, the ocean crashed, the fog rolled in and would roll out again come morning. And Maggie Brennan slept through it all, finally at peace with not knowing, not seeing, not controlling every variable. Finally, after 5 years of cameras and fear and desperate attempts to prevent the next decimal point error, she understood what her mother had known all along. You couldn't protect yourself into happiness. You could only live your way there, one vulnerable moment at a time, trusting that the world contained more Kate Morrisons than catastrophes, more grace than grief, more connection than the cameras could ever capture. It was enough. She was enough. The risk was worth it. And in the morning, she would wake and prove it again.